Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, let me thank our partners for this event tonight, MIT Club of Washington, D.C., and their members for being with us tonight. We are very privileged and honored to have Professor Shahid Naeem, Chair of the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology, also known as E3B, and the Director of Science at Earth Institute Center for Environmental Sustainability at Columbia to discuss feeding a hungry planet, which happens to be at the precipice of a mass extinction event. This would be in conversation with Dr. Colleen Becker. Professor Naeem is the Director of Science at Earth Institute Center for Environmental Sustainability and co-leads a consortium that includes the American Museum of Natural History, the New York Botanical Garden, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Wildlife Trust. Acting as a current department chair and professor of ecology in the E3B department, Naeem was recognized in 2008 as a Lenfest Distinguished Columbia faculty for his excellence as a teacher scholar. He is a recipient of both the Buell and Mercer Awards from the Ecological Society of America and was honored with an Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellowship in 2001, which promotes leadership, communication, public service, and the development of effective science-based policy in the environmental sciences. Naeem earned his MA and Ph.D. in Zoology from University of California, Berkeley in 1990 and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan, the University of Copenhagen, and the Imperial College London. Our host, Dr. Colleen Becker, is a London-based multi-award-winning serial entrepreneur building businesses aligned with Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. She holds a PhD in art history and archaeology from Columbia, taught in the core curriculum at Columbia, and completed her postdoc at the University of London. Previously, she had worked at the Smithsonian, Art Institute of Chicago, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Guggenheim. And without further ado, Colleen, Shahid, welcome.
Thanks for the great introduction, Kambiz. And it's a huge honor for me to be speaking with Dr. Naeem. And thank you so much for inviting me to join in this conversation.
Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here.
Great. So, you know, I had read your forthcoming primer on sustainable food production with huge amount of interest because I had been having these conversations with colleagues who are mostly working in finance about ways in which the financial community is addressing climate change in its methodologies, and also including the UN SDGs, and it's thinking about how to address climate change through technology, especially vis-a-vis risk. So, you know, I had read your book, and I'm really excited to hear your synopsis of your work and all of the research and preparation that went into its publication.
Well, thank you, Colleen. I'm actually quite excited that you're going to be hosting the conversation, because I think one of the reasons that I find our department, Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology, exciting is that it is actually trying to integrate the social sciences and the humanities, as well as the natural sciences. And you actually represent both the social sciences and the humanities, and so now you're dabbling in the natural sciences as well. So what a great person to have hosting this. And I thought it would be interesting to show sort of like what our department does and its scope, and then what my role in the science is. And I have an unusual way of starting And if that's okay with you, I'll share my screen. But what I love trying to show people, because I think especially during the pandemic year, we've all been trapped at home. And I've really loved traveling the world, in which I've gotten to see, especially over some 30 years, how much it's changed. And as you know, the focus of this discussion includes the idea of a mass extinction event, the sixth extinction that we're in. And you might wonder, well, how is that related to food and food sustainability? So let me start with, if I can share my screen here. Always a question of whether I'm going to succeed at that technological thing. Here we go. Let's see, is it sharing?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so now I want to start the, I'm not seeing it though, so, okay, there we go. There I am in the 1980s, just starting out after my undergraduate in graduate school at Berkeley, and had a lot more hair back then. But then I was working in Costa Rica, and on the question about the importance of biological diversity to tropical systems. And the person in the photo was another graduate student from Cornell University, but we both happened to be in Costa Rica, and we got married, and we've been together since the 1980s. And she actually is a historian of science. And so I think it's been a wonderful time to be able to think about the sort of history, the philosophical, the social side of ecology while I've had a chance to look and share the natural science. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 120 pictures, but they're at 1 second each, because there are 8.7 million species. And I was tempted to have a slide for each one of them, but I just thought we'd be here for a long time. So let me start, and I'll just run it without much of a commentary, but I'll have a running sort of monologue about what biodiversity is. And I've traveled all around the world, and I think when we think about biodiversity, most people think about animals, plants, and some of us about microorganisms. Certainly I do. You don't see them, but we know that half of the biomass of the world is actually the microorganisms. And while we don't see them, we know that they're important in the way nature functions. But when we look at these species, I think what we're attracted to is their color, their behavior, their morphology. And from a humanist perspective, sometimes the aesthetics that they represent, their sort of design, how we sort of recognize ourselves or humanity in them when we see creatures and feel some sort of connection to them. And that's sort of the social, the psychological, and humanist side. But from an ecological perspective, I think what ecologists see, and what perhaps many of you see, is that each of these species, as marvelous as they are also, like us, influencing the environment around them. And that's what ecology is about. Ecology is about the relationship between organisms and their environment. And I've gotten to travel to just about every place in the world except Antarctica. I hope to go there next year. And I've gotten to see the incredible diversity of animals, of plants, and microorganisms, and also to find out what the consequences of changing those species in their ecosystems is for the way ecosystems function. What I mean by that is that each of these ecosystems provide what we these days call services. They clean our air, they condition our air, they make our soil fertile, they make our water potable. They yield productive fields where we can grow crops and graze our animals, and they provide many, many services for us. The issue is that we've never paid for those services. We pay for electricity, we pay for water, we pay for security, whether we're paying through taxes for government and military. We pay for health services, we pay for education services, but we never pay for the services that nature provides. We don't think of them as providing service for us, but they do. There have been some economic analyses that if you were to ask, how much would it cost to get rid of all of this biodiversity, get rid of all this wild, how much would it cost to replace the services that they provide? And a bunch of economists and ecologists got together and they came up with the conclusion that if you consider the global GDP, gross domestic product, all of the sort of revenue that is generated from all our production across all of the countries in the world for 1 year, it would take twice the amount of production that we are currently doing in order to match what nature provides us for free. So in a way, you might consider that, well, I suppose you're going to have to work twice as hard for 1/3 what you're making, if you want to look at it that way. I sometimes imagine going to your mailbox and getting a bill for clean air, getting a bill for fresh water, getting a bill for global climate regulation, getting a bill for the sustainability of fisheries. You know, you sort through all these bills and you realize, I don't have the money to pay for this. Why is nature charging it for us? But again, you know, when we look at nature, as in this mother elephant who is pulling her baby back away from me and the camera, we also find a sort of identity with them, which I think creates some confusion. There's a cultural identity with them, but there's also this sort of functional and economic dimension to them, which I think is often sort of missed. Although these days I think we appreciate it more and more. So thank you for bearing with that unusual start, but I would always want to have the opportunity, if you allow me, to share with you pictures of the natural world. And in fact, in 2012, I was allowed to write a review paper about the 20 years of research that I and my colleagues have been doing. And we put together this diagram, which I think is beautiful, but is absolutely sort of impenetrable for most people because it's too complicated. But what it's actually trying to show from a scientific perspective, from a natural science perspective, and this is published in the journal Science, which is one of the most highly cited journals in the scientific fields, is that all of life is connected by 4.5 billion years, or 4 billion years of evolutionary history, and that these species live all over the planet. They live in saltwater, freshwater, and arid environments, and tropical environments, and temperate environments, Arctic environments. And while we think of them mostly as plants, animals, and microorganisms, they also are primarily responsible for shaping our atmosphere. The amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, the amount of methane that's there, all the greenhouse gases, and many of the other important gases that affect the sort of habitat of our planet is shaped by these animals. There's 1 trillion tons. I know that's a big number, but there's 1 trillion tons of animals on this planet. And that's just the carbon. I'm not even measuring the water and the calcium, just the carbon. And so you might imagine that 1 trillion tons of biology every second of every day of every year is really massively influencing our atmosphere. But what you see there is that if you look at the habitats, and we only show 3 habitats here, the idea is that all of them are changing, and they're changing because of what we call anthropic drivers. And what that means is that the landscapes are changing, the habitats are changing, and biodiversity is changing. And you've heard this expression, I'm sure, about us being in the 6th mass extinction. And that's largely driven by anthropic drivers, which include things like urbanization or pollution or other sorts of industrial activities or human activities, but primarily the dominant one is agriculture. And this was kind of a wake-up call for me in 2012 because it made me realize, well, I actually don't pay much attention to agriculture. My brother-in-law is a pig farmer in Iowa, and I'm just waiting for him to give me grief for having just published a book on food and agriculture and sustainability, because he probably wonders, what do I, an Ivy League professor, know about farming, right? But in reality, I've had a lot of experience. And in fact, you know, while doing my work, wherever I've been, there are always children who will come up to you. They're very often happy. They're intensely curious. They're funny. Sometimes I've had to have translators to help me see what they're up to. And it's been a wonderful experience. And I realized that then I did turn away from them so I can look at biological diversity and understand the natural world. And this is the world that I'm looking at. The world I imagine is on the top. It consists of the tropical forest, the temperate forest, the boreal forest, the biomes you're familiar with. But the modern world, your world, the world of our children, and the world of future generations is what you see in the middle and the bottom figures. They consist of croplands, pastures, and rangelands. Something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the world is now converted to farmland. And you might ask yourself, why am I, an ecologist, busy focusing on those other biomes when in fact the largest biome in the world, is the agrobiome, if you can think of it as a biome. Not the rainforest, not the boreal forest, not the tundra, but the agrobiome. And I thought, if I'm an ecologist, I should be studying that. Well, of course, as typical, students were way ahead of me, and I wanted to share with you some of the work my students have done. This is Vivian Valencia. She's a Mexican American who is in our lab, and she worked on agroforestry in Chiapas, Mexico, showing that even the most friendly agriculture that you could imagine for growing coffee still has negative consequences for the forest. And it affects these farmers. It affects their well-being and their productivity and how secure their livelihoods are. This is Stephen Wood. He's currently at Yale as a postdoctoral fellow, but he was working in Kenya with farmers who were adding a lot of fertilizer to their crops in order to get the food they needed to feed their families. And what he was doing was studying, using modern molecular techniques, how the health of the soil was changing and why they might want to think how they should use their fertilizer in different and more smart ways. We don't use the word smart, but in ways that actually are more effective than what they were doing. This is Jason Sursley, who loves working on grazing systems. I always find grazing systems to be sort of sad because all the trees are gone and much of the wildlife is gone. But for many people, where they cannot grow crops, they can grow animals and they can eat the animals. It is a primary source of food for them. And so he actually showed that when they have fallow lands, then they know to leave their lands fallow for a little while, that they can manage their fallow lands to actually improve the productivity of their herds. It was a really nice study that he did. And this is Meha Jain. She's off on the right there, the petite person. And she worked in India with 750 farmers in Gujarat, in the state of Gujarat. And she tried to find out, are the farmers making decisions about what crops they plant that are going to be the right plantings for climate change? Because in the next 50 years, they're going to see a very different monsoon. They're going to see very different periods of drought and flooding. And do they actually adapt to that climate change? It was brilliant. She's a professor at Michigan now, in really brilliant study that she did. And I admire the courage of my students. I admire their willingness to travel in harm's way and to do their research for years here at Columbia to get a PhD. We don't make it easy. And I think they've really made a difference in the world. And so I realized that after all these years, I have actually been involved with farming sort of like, indirectly through my students. And so I thought, let's write a book about this. Let's take, the 20 to 30 years of experience I've had from the natural sciences, and Suzanne Lipton and Tiffany Musin, who are people who worked with me when we taught courses on agriculture, New York agriculture, agriculture in Brazil, agriculture in India. But I had one of them was a biogeochemist, another was a social scientist. Actually, her undergraduate degree was in art history, so I'm sure Colleen will recognize, will see the attraction to that. She's now a graduate student in California and is actually getting a PhD in sustainable agriculture. And Tiff is now working for USDA. On sustainability. So we put together this book. Columbia University has a series that's coming out of the Earth Institute that are primers. Alex Halliday, who's British, calls them primers for sustainability. And in that, I found myself doing the illustrations and writing about things that I really hadn't had a chance to think about until the book motivated me to do so. So I'm looking forward to having a chance to chat more about this endeavor here. But some of the things, I observed was that, from a biological perspective, I think we sometimes don't realize that if we consider what is the most massive species on the world as the most successful, that's us. Because if you look at the total mass of carbon of all the wild mammals of the world, we're talking about elephants, hippos, rhinos, hartebeests, you name it, it all adds up to about 7 million tons. Again, we're looking just at carbon. We tend not to look at water or other elements. But if you look at the total mass of carbon found in all of humanity, it's about 60 million tons. We don't think of it very much. We think of our little children, we think of our friends, and some of them are big, some of them are small. But in fact, when you add it all up, we are by far, by a factor of 10 almost, the most massive species on this earth. And so what we do has the power to change, right? And then if you look at the total mass of livestock, That's 100 million. This means chickens, goats, and cattle, and pigs, right? Now, I actually maintain that that 100 million tons is also our 100 million tons, because none of those creatures would exist if we didn't care for them, feed them, protect them, give them medicine, and water them. So in a way, we actually are the most massive species the planet has never known. The planet has never known a species like us. We really are a planet that's being, some people refer to it as a domestic planet that's actually being driven by the decisions we make in our life. Just to give you a feel for that, and this is in the book as well, we said, okay, so what is it like for one day of feeding people, right? So at a minimum, and we're using the UN sort of guidelines for what people would need to just sort of barely stay alive. At a minimum, we would need 380 billion liters or 80 billion gallons of water, 3 million tons of fruits and vegetables, and about 15 billion calories of energy, which would mostly come in the form of wheat or maize or rice, right? And that's every day. This is not some annual or decadal projection. This is what you need to produce every single day for the billions of people on this planet. And then if we go on, we'd say, well, what do you need if we want to feed the additional, perhaps, 3 billion more people who will join us by 2100? We'll need another 4.8 billion gallons of water, for another 1.4 million tons of fruits and vegetables, and another 1.8 million tons of, let's say, flour. Right? I'm just translating corn, rice, and everything into one grain flour, right? And again, that would be every day. And there have been many analyses, and we address this in the book. Can we actually feed this planet? We can do it now, but at incredible environmental costs. The question is, can we do it into the future? And many of the analyses that have been done, and there have been dozens of studies that say we can. But there's a lot of things we have to do to make that possible. So I found myself doing things like taking the natural science. I'm teaching right now. Students were surprised to see me in a suit and tie, but I said, hey, I'm speaking to the alum. I got to wear a suit and tie today. Scientists usually don't dress as formally as this, but this, you may have recognized, this is our science paper. And now it's in a primer, which anybody should be able to read, to understand how the natural science is actually translated into sort of the real or applied science of agriculture and food sustainability. We also talk about the importance of integrating the inorganic, the organic chemistry, the cell molecular biology, the physiology and morphology. Food agriculture is a truly integrative science. And I'm sure some of this is probably creating stress for some of you who've had to go through organic chemistry or inorganic chemistry. But in reality, if you're going to try to understand an agricultural system, you have to approach it from many different directions. And we try to make that clear in the book. Ideas of stability, the idea that there are different valleys, and if the ball rolls up to the top and falls into another valley, that valley could be a bad valley to fall into. And so the idea is that if you look at things like a dry land or a cropland or a kelp forest or a fishery, that if you do things like overgraze, over-fertilize, get rid of the top predators like the salmon or the shark, or overfish, you can actually change all of those in ways that are very, very hard to reverse. That's what we call about shifting into alternative stable states. That's natural science made accessible to people who want to tackle these problems without having to go through a Columbia degree. But it also forced us, and this is where my co-authors have really helped me, to understand things like finance, something that Colleen is a pro at, understanding, the sort of humanist knowledge, things like, religion, philosophy, know-how that's passed down from parent to child. And then there's the social connections, our family groups, our governments, and so forth. And then there's also technology and the information that we have about how to manage our systems through technology. But the thing that's often forgotten is the natural capital, right? And natural capital accounting is probably one of the biggest areas right now in sustainability science, because if you leave natural capital out, which has to do with air, water, soil, plants, animals, microorganisms, you cannot actually lead to sustainable development, That's hard because the people who are trained in natural sciences don't really get good training in the social sciences. People trained in the social sciences don't get good training in the natural sciences. We hope to change that. So what happens is you get these big box and arrow diagrams that actually mostly put people to sleep, right? But it does, I think, if you sort of squint at it, give you a sense of how complex it is. There is the ecological system, there's the socioeconomic system, and these two things are tightly integrated to one another. Change one and the other changes. And all of those interactions between the socioeconomic and the natural ecosystems of the world will affect our human well-being. So it's just three components: ecosystem, socioeconomic system, and human well-being, all of which are incredibly complicated, but important to keep in mind. So, we now talk about ecosystem services. I began by saying that people now are beginning to realize we have to pay for these services. We classify them into supporting, provisioning, regulating services, and cultural services. People like to go hunting, people like to go birding, people like to look at wildlife. Some people just like to know, even though they'll never see it, they like to know that the polar bear is around. They like to know that the blue whale is in the ocean. There are many, many different sort of cultural values that people attach to nature, as well as the fact that they provide clean air and clean water and fertile soils. And then all of that affects human well-being. I did a review of human well-being in nature, and it turns out that right now in a review paper, there are something like 800 different variables that people have included in human well-being. It's not just health, but it's also a sense of security. It's good family relations. It's good social relations. It also has to do with your sense of the fairness, equity. Many, you could go down a list of 800 things that people consider that are important to our well-being. So if you ask me, I am glad I am a natural scientist and had to put up with calculus and organic chemistry, because I don't know how the social scientists can tackle. It's definitely much more complicated, in my opinion, than ecological systems. More box and arrow diagrams, but mostly what they're doing is trying to connect human well-being with biodiversity, the services it provides, and economic development. And the big thing is to transition. And Colleen is telling me that, you can see these sort of parallels in trying to transition from from unsustainable development or economic development practices to sustainable ones. It happens a lot in the energy industry, as well as energy sector, as well as it does in the agricultural sector. More box and arrow diagrams, but in the book we try to translate what we're talking about when you look at things like international agreements where they talk about the importance of the services nature provides and how to protect them and how to pay for them, that in reality what we're talking about is transitions in landscapes. I went to the Pantanal. This is actually a drawing I did of what I saw. One of the most beautiful, diverse, biogeochemically active wetlands in the world. I encourage you to go visit if you can. Many people go there to see the jaguars, but it's all being changed to grazing lands and to agriculture, sugarcane for biofuel, bioenergy. And the question is, that's great because we need the food and we need renewable energy, but there are costs. It's not coming free. And the question is how you balance that. And then there is the actual sort of dietary risk. There are many health risks that we face, but dietary health risks are among the biggest of the health risks that the world faces. This global map shows that if you look at the number of days of sort of productive lives that people have lost, or the number of years that they've lost, it's not that they've died, but their lifetime contribution in production has declined by years, right? You'll notice that the United States is not doing so well, nor is Asia, nor is many Eastern Europe. I mean, we have bad diets, right? It's the Cheetos, it's the McDonald's, right? We have access to so much food, we don't necessarily make the right choices. And if you look at some of the other countries where some of these people are very, very poor, their diets are actually better than ours, right? Because it's actually more balanced and they get more exercise, they walk long distances, they haul water. Yes, they're poor, they don't have good medical care, but from a dietary perspective, many of them actually have better diets than we do. And this is an interesting thing to consider when we talk about globalized economy and global systems. And then finally, the international agreements. like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, in which all of the nations of the world have committed to achieving 17 different goals, such as eliminating hunger, eliminating poverty, achieving universal education, improving gender equity and equality, all 17 different goals. Only 2 of them have anything to do with the environment. And a number of studies, this actually comes from The Economist, the journal The Economist, that if you actually look at those sustainable development goals, you'll find that from the economic, the environmental, and the social perspective, and we're looking at sustainable food systems, that the environment comes into almost every one of these things. It really, I mean, might seem strange, but it should be part of universal education. It should be part of alleviating hunger. It should be part, don't just give calories, but give balanced diets, right? It should be part of managing terrestrial and marine systems. And so I love this study because it actually really pointed to the importance of having an integrated view. So there's a lot here that I've talked about, I've sort of whizzed through it. And I have to say, my students have noticed that the more excited I get, the faster I talk, so they have to slow me down by asking questions. But in the brief time, we've talked about natural capital accounting and its importance. That's a social, natural science integrative endeavor. We've talked about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is a global effort which involves many, many objectives. And Jeff Sachs is actually, he's an economist here at Columbia University. He's one of the leaders in this particular program. He has been for now some 20 years, I think. And we only have till 2030. This is 2021. So we really don't have much longer to achieve those lofty goals, and there are 17 of them. And then the other thing is that one of the things we need to do we say in our book is that if you really want to feed, say 10 billion by 2050, remember I told you that almost all the studies, I think all of the studies says we can do it. So when I look through the studies that, how they said we could do it, well, one of the things we have to do it is we all have to become vegetarians. And my own sense was, good luck with that, right? Because, they just said, yeah, we could feed 10 billion by 2050 if everybody becomes a vegetarian. And I thought, well, how do you achieve that, right? And it's quite possible that some of these things like meat substitutes or lab-based meat might be one of the ways to achieve that. And then there are other things which, I think ecologists are not that familiar with, but we have to realize that agriculture is a very old school business, following old school business practices. And transitioning from the old school agribusiness and farming practices to new perspectives is going to have a lot of sort of inertia there. Vertical integration is being pursued by agribusinesses because it provides sort of an efficiency in their production, and also it stabilizes their ability to provide the products that they sell to their consumers. But it comes at a cost to the smallholder farmers, and the majority of farmers in the world are smallholder farmers who then wind up contributing their produce to these companies through vertical integration. And while that's good for the corporations, the question is, can we achieve food sovereignty and food justice and some of these other social and humanist aspects of agriculture while we have the vertical integration going on? And then finally, I think insurance is a big thing. The world is changing, climate is changing, food security is a big issue, drought, fires, pests that are emerging because the climate is warmer, storms which are more destructive on plantations. One of our professors, Maria Uriarte, has been working in Puerto Rico for the last 17 years, and she has watched these storms with increasing strength destroy the Puerto Rican agroecosystems. And so, if you're in the insurance business, what's happening in the environment is just as important as many of the other things that one has to consider, such as the rise in maybe terrorism, other sorts of insecurities that we're facing. So that is my whirlwind tour of what I've done, what our department does, and also I think when I had the opportunity to sit down with my colleagues and my students and put together natural science and social science the best I could in this primer. I really saw that the future is one that has so many frontiers, each of which are exciting, and really are looking for people who have the capacity to cross disciplines, to build bridges. When I was working in Mount Kilimanjaro, you know, the person that was the most important for the German project that was there was the pastor, because the pastor had to tell the people in the village that what we were doing was a good thing. And once he said it was a good thing, they were willing to help us understand, you know, their farming practices, why they did what they did, how they were changing Mount Kilimanjaro, which affects the water that they use for irrigating their crops. And it made me realize I have no training in theology. I have no training in these, but I do at least understand the importance of reaching out to people who do. So that's why when I heard that Colleen was willing to host this, I thought, perfect, right? We have the perfect host for this. I'm going to turn it over to you. I rattled on for quite a while.
Oh, I wouldn't call it rattling. I mean, that was just an absolutely fascinating sort of overview, not only of the research that's gone into this forthcoming publication, which we're all really excited about and anticipating, but also, you know, the work that you've been doing throughout the course of your career, and also how, you know, your colleagues have been contributing and how you've been developing these various programs and centers and consortia through Columbia. So, you know, I think that is absolutely fantastic. And when I heard that Columbia had established a climate college, I was just thrilled, and I thought, you know, this is exactly what the world needs. And so you and I have been talking about things that came up in the book, which might be of interest for an interdisciplinary or general professional audience. And you talked quite a bit about natural capital accounting, and then also the idea of ecosystem services. And I know that, for example, in very specialized and niche sort of high-level EU study groups and research groups, which are contributing to government policy over here on this side of the Atlantic, these are really sort of hot topics. And even today, for example, I had been invited to attend through the Climate Disclosure Standards Board an accounting for climate workshop. And this is, you know, feeding into the work of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which Michael Bloomberg chairs, and which, of course, contributes to all of these methodologies that these massive financial institutions and wealth and asset managers like BlackRock are using to create these AI-enabled rules engines to assess precisely what you were discussing earlier in this talk, which is risk and climatological risk, and how this affects the insurance industry, and whether or not, you know, they should be underwriting, you know, gas and oil exploration projects, or, you know, what kind of risk are they exposed to, for example, when there's, you know, the potential for a tsunami event. So, you know, these ecological sort of microcosms that you've been studying throughout your career, they can be amplified, you know, through various cross industry conversations. So for example, earlier this week, I had been invited to a Fed Tech Women talk. I belong to this group, Fed Tech Women, which is all about regulation and compliance. And they were saying, all we care about is data and consistency in policy. And how can we achieve that? And I thought that would be a fantastic question to ask you. So how can ecologists contribute to the sort of massive gaps and inconsistencies and fragmented data sets that, you know, are publicly available, but are really regurgitated by these various industries because they're so narrow and so impoverished in a way? That was one of my questions, but I have lots of questions.
No, that's a great question. In fact, I met with the Carbon Disclosure Project group once, because I used to be on the Columbia committee that speaks to the trustees about the sort of the ethics of their investment portfolio. So I had to address the environmental ethics. There were other sorts of ethics that they addressed. And I said, hey, why don't you have a biodiversity disclosure project thing? And they said, we can measure carbon, you tell us how to measure biodiversity. And I was stuck. Because in fact, the data, they're now coming, but at the time, the data for biodiversity is very, very complicated. It involves genomic data. It involves things like taxonomic data. It involves location. we need to know the sort of geopositioning of where these species are, where these biomes are. It involves dynamics when you have species that migrate great distances, right? And so actually, it's interesting because in a couple of weeks, I'm actually participating in a National Science Foundation assessment of a bunch of proposals that came in to build a national environmental data center so that people who are interested in actually being much more quantitative about many of these sort of aspirational goals and objectives that are being established by local, federal, and global agencies, they can actually come up with sort of answers or analyses that resonate with decision makers, right? It's nice to say, oh, you'll be sorry if you lose biodiversity. It's another thing to say it will cost you X number of dollars if you wind up reducing biodiversity by this much. So there are now databases for plants, databases for microorganisms. There's a fish base called FishBase, which has all the data that you would need about fish, fisheries, the size of fish, the nutritional qualities of fish. The problem is that it's an enormous amount of data. The technology is evolving fast. You mentioned AI, the winner. So what I'm going to be doing is the panels to decide who's going to get to be this $30 million national center for environmental data. And they absolutely must have a huge artificial intelligence component of the work they're going to do. And they must interact. They must prove that they're going to interact not just with academics and researchers, but also with governmental agencies, with the business sector, and with media as well. Of course, they'll expect that there'll be a very large attention to diversity and to education, making sure they reach out to K through 12, not just to citizen scientists in college. So there's it's happening now. But I have to say that my student who's working on the 700 farmers, where she had how old were the farmers, what's their family size, what was their caste? They're in India, right? What was their income? What was their literacy? How many children did they have? Did they get remittances from the urban, from their relatives living in the cities? And the number of social variables she had to include along with the natural variables meant that then she was using remote sensing and satellite imaging to understand where these farmers were in the Gujarat state. We had to rent time on Google servers to handle terabytes of data for weeks on end, and it cost a fortune just to come up with a multifaceted, multivariate understanding of what are the consequences of the farmers in India making decisions that they are making as the monsoon changes. The department she's actually in is a new department at Michigan that actually is combining the social sciences and the natural sciences. She was like a shoo-in for that job. But we need more things like that. So I think the data is a big issue, but progress is going that way really fast. And I think the next time the Carbon Disclosure Project says, well, where are the data? I think I'll be able to point to it.
Well, that's fantastic news. But also, I mean, what you're saying is so timely because, just last year, there was this UN report on financing sustainable development. So I could see an immediate application for all of the, for all of the reasons you've just stated, which is, there are socio-cultural aspects at play and dynamics at play when you're considering how sustainability can be implemented and executed upon in unfamiliar or indeed, different and diverse locations. Well, I don't want to spend too much time with my questions because there's a whole roster of questions from the audience as well, but I did want to skip forward to one last question, which was about genetic modification and, new forms of food. And one question that came to my mind quite recently was, well, if you're going to genetically modify food, how can you do that in a sustainable way? I mean, when we think of genetic modification, that doesn't necessarily have a sustainability aura about it at the moment, I would say. But how can that be reframed in a way that gives us a view into how that could be done in a sustainable way or to promote sustainable practices?
It's a very complex issue, in part because there's a lot of sort of cultural dimensions to the problem. And there are a lot of people who just simply don't like genetically modified organisms because they have come to the conclusion that they're not desirable and they have harmful environmental effects. Now, I'm not a fan of them, but I will say that a lot of the fear of them is unwarranted, really. I mean, we are facing, I'd much rather use a genetically modified organism than spray a field with a pesticide, to tell you the truth. But the thing is that remember I was talking about all the studies that have asked, can we feed 10 billion by 2050? And the conclusion was we all had to become vegetarians. Another conclusion was that farming must embrace genetically modified organisms, because that is going to be the only way that they'll be able to develop strains which are resistant to drought, resistant to heat shock, resistant to emerging diseases. And there are limits to what you can do with genetic modification because it tends to be focused on this gene and that gene and that gene. Very often, if you want to get something that's drought tolerant or more nutritious, that's basically going to require good old-fashioned plant breeding, which is a slow process. But there are many things you can do. And these days, they're even genetically modifying fish, right? Because aquaculture, I think right now, almost half of the fish we eat comes from aquaculture. It's not all caught from wild caught fisheries. So it's a very important aspect of sustainability, but you'll have to convince people that it can be an important part, and I think somehow get them to understand that a lot of the fear in many cases is unwarranted. One of the social fears, which I think is genuine, is that genetically modified organisms right now are currently controlled by agribusiness. And that actually then means that this could actually sort of muscle out the smallholder farmers who can't afford some of these products and will actually play into the large landhold farmers and to agribusinesses, especially with the vertical integration. So that's a social fear that I think is actually more real than the biological fear.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an economic problem as well. And I won't give away, the secret sauce, but the paper that you had shared with me, which is forthcoming, is also about the economic dimensions of your research and a sort of, turn in the field of ecology towards the economic problems. So, I'll be very interested to read, all of the further research that you're doing on the sort of economic dimensionality of making these transitions from one paradigm to the next. And I imagine that, genetically modified food, even in the, in the promotion of sustainability, is going to be a very hard sell in the EU, where
That's right.
of course, a whole cultural dimension. There's heritage movements around food in France. Italy has a whole slow food movement. And obviously, I mean, I love Mediterranean cuisine. So, I'm gonna find it very interesting to see how and if this is introduced, but also if there is any sort of intercultural exchange in terms of their methods, their traditional heritage methods of farming, which undoubtedly are more sustainable than agribusiness, which you've just been describing as well. But I don't know if that can really be scaled. And I don't know if it would be scalable to the extent that it's able to feed the amount of people in the quantities that you were describing earlier in your presentation.
I think you hit it right on the nose there. In fact, we talk about this in our book, that in fact, if you consider that the majority of the people in the world are poor, we're talking about 80 to 90% of them are poor, that many of them can only afford food that's produced cheaply. And the food that's produced cheaply is through industrial agriculture, right? So we're stuck in this sort of trap that poor people need cheaply produced food, but that's not sustainable production. Sustainable production, organic and so forth, right now, I think we can scale up, is actually a very small scale. But then poor people can't afford that food. And so we're sort of in this trap that they're the ones that would benefit from us moving away from industrial agriculture, but they can't afford the products that's there. And I think, but again, I think that one of the co-authors on our forthcoming paper, she was a graduate student here at Columbia in environmental economics, and she's now an assistant professor in Toulouse, in France, and she's French, so I'm sure she's happy to go back, especially given current politics here. And she actually is at the forefront of this sort of new field of environment. It's not that new, but it's, you know, seeing new theory, new ideas in which when somebody says, here's an economic problem we have, um, this new breed of environmental economists is ready to tackle them. And again, she came out of Columbia University because there is actually a sustainable development Ph.D. over in the School of International Public Affairs. It's a small program, but those students are learning to actually combine economics with natural science. So she would come to our lab meetings and do ecology, right? But then she would set us straight about, you know, the realities of economics. So I wish I could actually be a student again and go take her classes. I'd have to learn French, but still, it would be worth it.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I mean, what an incredibly relevant degree right now, you know, but I mean, 20, 25 years ago, who knew that these very interdisciplinary, very cutting edge sort of ways of approaching problems would be so urgent and pressing? I mean, there's such a need for this kind of, you know, culling knowledge from different sources and then, you know, bringing it all together to solve problems, you know, in a really efficacious way. But do you mind if I turn my attention to some of the questions from the audience before it gets—
That sounds like fun. Yeah. I wish I could be there with them. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that there should be some good ones. So let's see. Oh, they want to know about the paper that is forthcoming. So maybe if you wouldn't mind, you know, I don't want to sort of give away your IP before it's published or anything like that, but maybe you could sort of talk about some of the ways the themes from the primer that is just going to be published sort of carry on through to the next bit of research that you will be publishing in, I think it's November or October.
yeah, I think it's we've already seen the proofs, so it's it's ready to go. But I think, you know, it came out of this interest in getting ecologists to stop thinking like, you know, the ecologists that work in the tropical rainforests. And so ecologists, and I'm one of them, we're really interested in ideas of stability. And this usually involves doing things like, you know, calculating the eigenvectors and the Jacobian matrix and looking at things like local versus global stability. And while this is exciting and we have great times, you know, doing the mathematics and the computer simulations and the experiments, I don't think it resonates with anybody except the ecologists. But if you talk about risk, right, which people understand risk, and yet stability and risk are obviously related to one another. It's a matter of just changing the way we do our research. And I feel that economists are the ones who have really done a great job of taking this sort of fuzzy idea of risk and making it concrete, right? Because risk management, portfolio management, it's all about risk. It's all about market risk. It's all about risk in investments and so forth. And then when you actually start considering that model for how we talk about natural resources, I then think that people will, it'll resonate more. And that's what that paper is suggesting. And I think we could go down and think of all the different major ideas in ecology, and which is what the primer was trying to do, and translate it into or connect it to fields that actually have great traction in the world, right? I think that the ideas of risk from the economic perspective has great traction in the insurance industry, in the markets, right? In finance, and stability, they probably never heard of. so we can talk about that. Yeah, you mentioned the climate school. I think the climate school is going to be Columbia. Is just, I think it's the first school they're adding since World War I, for all I know. That, you know, it'll be a long time. It takes a long time to build a school, but it'll have its own faculty, its own, you know, undergraduate and graduate programs. And this will be a new breed of people who will probably be required to take chemistry, to take economics, and maybe take theology. I mean, you know, to really be, you know, the modern student.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds terrific. I mean, it's just all about, you know, building like this amazing interdisciplinary scholar that can address these issues from a variety of different perspectives. So let's see. Yeah, so where can people buy your primer? Can they get it online, or is it mostly, going to be a textbook, or is it going to be available in the Columbia bookstore, or how can people get their hands on this?
Well, I don't know if it'll be in the, Columbia usually gets any book that's from Columbia. It's University Press. So in a way, we already have the Columbia, the Columbia market. But yeah, it'll be available, and there'll even be an electronic version that'll be available as well, but not till November. I already have the hard copy. But who's going to buy the hard copy in this day and age, right? Libraries will buy the hard copy, but the paperback will be coming out soon, and then the electronic version. And I think that, what I like about the primers is they're reasonably priced. Science books often cost $100, $200, $300. I've paid as much as $800 for a science book. And the primers are actually relatively inexpensive, and the editors go through it and make sure that it's accessible to a broad audience. So I'm excited about it. There's more than one. Columbia University, I think, has 3 primers out. There's a primer on climate change. And they also have a primer that has come out on energy, sustainable energy. So, and they have a series that'll be coming out over time. So I'm glad that we were able to contribute to that. So it'll be, yeah, you can buy it on Amazon if you don't mind the really sort of questionable business practices of Amazon, but you can get it through them. And Columbia University Bookstore will probably be selling it once it's available. It'll be widely available. I hope that, Columbia now has a lot of books that are available electronically. So if you have a uni and you have access to the libraries, you may be able just to download it. I know I can download a bunch of books now from the Columbia University just by going in with my uni, and I have library privileges. I don't know if the alum will, but the electronic age is an interesting age because the availability of information actually go both good and bad, as you know, what's going on with the pandemic and information about vaccines and their efficacy and so forth. It becomes complicated. But I do think that the electronic availability of these will be good. And if people want to contact me, they should feel free to do so. I can also provide perhaps to the Columbia alum the PowerPoint presentation of which I gave, and also the reference to that paper that's coming out in current biology. We're trying to pay for it to be open access so that you can just download it. And so if we can succeed in doing that, then people will be able to download it free.
If I can be permitted one last question before our time is up, it has to do with funding all of these amazing projects and all of this fantastic work that you're doing over at Columbia. I mean, when you were talking about FishBase and all of these different types of databases, it just struck me that these obviously are very expensive programs to operate, particularly since you're doing all of this modeling and you're needing to draw on all of these different resources and do all of these different kinds of field work. And in addition to the, all of the modeling that you're doing, and you need all of these tools, and then you need to actually develop the databases and get them out in the public. And then I imagine that there must be some sort of public-private partnership that could be drawn on to finance these things, because this data is super valuable. And I'm not just talking about the value from a monetization perspective, because people monetize data like this all the time, but also, it's just valuable for the public sphere. I mean, every day in my inbox, I get like some new report that some new, research group, like at the UN or, McKinsey Global Institute has done a sustainable finance thing. And like every single, major institution in the world, I feel, is focused on sustainability. And it just seems to me like the work that you're doing, like people should be throwing money at it. So I'm just but it also does sound very expensive. It's like valuable and expensive, which I think is a signature trait of quality anyway. But how do you go about, getting the wherewithal means to develop these projects?
Well, so it's yes, the funding is really important because, as you said, it's expensive, especially data. Data science is expensive. It seems like it shouldn't be because it's just electrons, but actually the computers, they get outdated, they're quite expensive, you have to replace them every year and so forth. Yes, but we actually, like our department was actually created through the donation by the Rasmussen Foundation to Don Melnick. And so they gave us $6 million to build the consortium you mentioned earlier. And they gave us another $6 million to build the department. And then the university contributed, I think, probably about $10 million. So it was kind of a matching. Root de Vries is an endowed professor. So the Denning family really thought sustainability is really important. And they said, we will fund a professor if you hire them. But it has to be in sustainability science. So Root de Vries, she's a member of the National Academy. She's a MacArthur Genius Award. She's now the Dean of the Climate School. She's actually in our department. She actually is an endowed professor. Her title is the Denning Family Professor of Sustainability Science. Don Melnick was, the Thomas H. Morgan Professor of Conservation Biology. And so endowed faculty, endowed graduate fellowships, I think the private sources of funding are very important because the federal agencies fund research, they fund the building of research centers. But then for individual things which are targeted more towards scholarly resources and human resources, that often comes from private and also corporate as well. So we were flying our drones, and we were getting way too much data than we could handle with our little laptops. And actually we had a connection from Microsoft in which they actually provided us with virtual computers, which we could run our software on and analyze the data. We were doing 3D reconstructions of forests, which was, taking my computer like a week to do. And so there was a person from Microsoft who, word got around, and he was able to arrange for them to provide us, without charging, access to their incredible computers. So it's federal agency funding for research. It's donors who are interested in seeing this field move forward, like the building of our department, the funding of research. I mean, I remember, I'll just tell you a story of somebody who really wanted to study the impact of different factors on lion conservation. Not quite related, but so she really needed to build these life-size lion dolls. And put them out there. And she wanted to be able to change their morphology, the size of their mane and something like that. And somebody just thought that was such really cool science that they actually funded, I think it was FAO Schwartz back when they were saying, to actually create the dolls and then actually pay for the crating and the shipping of these things, which she couldn't afford, to Kenya where she was doing her work. And just because somebody thought, this is expensive work, but they'd like to see it done. So it ranges quite a bit. People have, the climate school, I think, has both private and university and agency funding to see that through. It's going to take probably 10 years to build it. But the hope is that we'll get a new building on the Manhattanville that will house the climate center. So that is it. As always, I think that we're in a great space right now because the last 4 years before the Biden-Harris administration was not very friendly towards environment. The climate deniers were sort of reining the government funding. But fortunately, if you actually look at it, say the Trump administration wanted to cut all of the funding in the National Science Foundation for Environmental Research and cut EPA as well. But the president doesn't actually control the budget. Congress controls the budget. And much to our surprise, even though we're going through some financial hardships because of the pandemic, they actually increased the funding for our research. So Congress, in spite of all of the rhetoric and the public face that they put forward, behind the scenes, they actually are interested in seeing our science being healthy, global leaders, and some of the best climate science that's done in the world. And I don't mean this, to be a raving, patriot. I think in the world is done in the United States, which is one of the few countries that won't sign onto the climate compact. That doesn't mean we can't do good science. I mean, we do work I do work with Kevin Griffin in the tundra in the Arctic, looking at how climate change is affecting carbon efflux in the tundra. That's where I fly my drones. And that work is funded by the National Science Foundation. It all has to do with climate change. So in spite of the fact that you have all these Congress people who would say that they're climate change deniers, behind the scenes, they're funding really excellent science. And Columbia has some of the best climate scientists in the world. in spite of the rhetoric that you hear in our government or perhaps in the public, which is why the climate school is being built, because we have so much excellence here. So I think that, you know, we have to forget about the politics of this and look to what it is we want to achieve. I think Bollinger really wanted a couple of things about the university. One is that he wanted to be more global in his perspective. So he out of these sort of created the global centers. But now he's actually what he's called the fourth purpose, right? And what he meant is that, you know, there's scholarship, there's service and so forth. But the other thing was actually that the university could help make the world a better place. And that's why I think he got pretty excited about the climate school, because if you ask yourself, what is the biggest challenge we face right now? There are actually 5 of them, but climate change is one of them, right? Emerging diseases is the second. We study the ecology of emerging diseases in our department. And then mass extinction is another of the 5, right? Because that's actually the tough one, because it's very hard to fix that. You know, when you lose a species, it's, you know, unless you believe in Jurassic Park, it's actually gone, right? And if it's important to our well-being, it's going to be the devil to bring it back, right? We can fix climate change. We can fix emerging diseases and find vaccines and you know, find ways to control their spread and so forth. But the reason I really feel that the work we're doing in our department on mass extinction is the most important is because, well, it's the toughest, but it's also the one that's the most difficult to reverse, right? And we are projected to be losing 50% of the diversity of life on Earth by 2050. So I can't imagine, you know, how our children will live in a world in which half of the beauty of the world is gone. And there's so many studies that have shown that a walk in a green space, a walk in a park, being exposed to nature, especially when you're very young, is really important to mental well-being and to mental and to cognitive development. There's actually been studies that show that children who are exposed to wild habitats actually have fewer immune and allergy diseases. Because one of the things about being in a clean urban environment is you're not exposed to the diversity of compounds that are in nature. This was done in Finland. I don't know if that's a good model system for the US, but you know, if we lose the natural world that actually makes us a robust species, it's going to be hard to bring it back. I mean, I wouldn't work in this field if I wasn't optimistic. You can tell by my cheery disposition. I think if you're gonna do anything, if you like a challenge, right? I think what we're doing in E3B is really, you know, the toughest challenge, you know, if you really want to take it on. But it all interacts. I mean, if you're gonna, one of the reasons that biodiversity is declining is because of climate change. You know, emerging diseases are actually killing wildlife as well as killing people. Right, we're losing a lot of species to strange diseases. Right, they're finding COVID in gorillas right now. Right. And there are strange diseases that are affecting sea turtles, strange diseases that are affecting wildlife. Of all forms, seabirds colonies are disappearing. Coral reefs are bleaching, some of it because of disease. So most of the things that affect us affect nature as well. We're part of the living world, right? And I think that, you know, this if we can actually get to the realization that we are part of the living world, and anything we do for the living world, you know, it's our home. If we improve our home, our lives are better for it. Then this thing will turn around. It absolutely will, right? It's moving fast though, so we need to keep up with the change.
It's terrifying. And, you know, President Biden, I know, has just announced a DARPA for health, particularly because the Moderna vaccine was developed through a DARPA. And so he's devoted, you know, tens of millions to health. He's also announced a DARPA for climate change, but maybe there needs to be a DARPA for biodiversity loss and mass extinction. You know, maybe
Yeah.
is, you know, a Department of Defense issue as much as climate change is a Department of Defense issue. You know, we need to defend our biodiversity and you know, the ecology that we all depend on for life and for, you know, for health. And it's not simply a matter of you know, taking a Sunday stroll, you know, in a green space or something like that, but it's actually like we need clean air, we need fresh water, and we need all of these ecological services that are provided to us for free by Mother Nature. So, maybe there needs to be pressure applied to this new government, which does seem open.
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten funding from USAID. Some of the work we did in Africa was funded there because they actually believe that if you want to improve the sort of economic and social well-being of the people, that the environment is an important part of that. So we actually got money for the government to do that. The Department of Justice has invested in some of the idea that the loss of diversity, if it leads to losses in natural resources for people in impoverished regions, because a lot of places where people are poor, they really depend on nature more than we do. I can go to Whole Foods and get what I want, but other people have to go to the field to get their food. And that a lot of the impoverished regions where people become desperate then often be the places that are susceptible to terrorism and ideologies that breed terrorism. And they thought, that maybe we can stamp out this problem before it sort of, gets out of hand. So they have actually looked into it. There is actually research on the topic. And the Biden-Harris administration actually has a plan to set aside 30% of the United States for biodiversity by 2030, I forget, this is numerical alliteration. But they want to set aside 1/3 of the US for biodiversity and the services that nature provides. E.O. Wilson is pushing for 50% of the world to be set aside for the services they provide. But this new administration actually is very, is very forward thinking on it, and they have a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. It's just that the conservatives are not as vocal about it, but we do actually find support from both sides. I think that conservatives have always been interested in the environment. It's just in the current political ideology, it sort of has to go hand in hand with some of the other interests that they have. But behind the scenes, you will find that people do care about clean air, clean water. They do care about national parks. They do care about their children having green spaces to wander in, and they do care about the services that nature provides. So I'm optimistic that my spouse is a historian of science, and she says, she constantly points out that, I know a lot about biogeochemistry and about genetics and genomics and about taxonomy and population processes, but I should be careful when I start talking about politics, about the social science, and especially about history. And she's got a point there. I've gone to the History of Science Society meetings, and, really each discipline has mastered its field. And it's hard to cross over, but these marriages, and in some cases real marriages between the different fields, actually I think are the way to go. Yeah, I think that the DARPA projects you mentioned are really really fascinating, but DARPA also funded ideas about how to get to an exoplanet.
Well, DARPA, very awful things, but it's also, developed the internet.
Yeah.
Agent Orange, it goes all the way from Agent Orange to the internet.
No, DARPA is amazing. I think that what was interesting about getting to an exoplanet was the idea, okay, well, suppose we don't succeed, right, in saving Earth. Maybe we should start thinking about how to get to another planet now. So they're actually funding. I was actually one of the co-PIs on a grant to DARPA to figure out how to get to an exoplanet in case we just can't succeed in fixing this one. It was fun. We weren't funded. So we weren't funded.
I think DARPA was actually developed as a space agency anyway, wasn't it? In response to Sputnik.
That's probably true, yeah.
Sputnik, and then Eisenhower established ARPA, which became DARPA, and then again ARPA, and then again DARPA. So there you have it. But I will really look forward to hearing about how Columbia becomes even more involved in these political discussions, comfortable or uncomfortable as you may feel about sharing your expertise in various political contexts. I do think that given the climate school that's being built, I think that Columbia is going to be called upon, even more frequently than it is now, because you're going to be developing these interdisciplinary experts. So let me just see if there's one last question that from the audience, and then I think we're well over time.
Hi, Colleen. This is Miyako. I'm the admin. We actually have 15 minutes left, and there are a handful of questions in the Q&A. So I don't know if you can pull up that box. If not, I can read them out for you.
The Q&A. Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, I was looking in the chat. Okay, I work with the Census Bureau, so our number shows we have closer to 7.8 billion people now. Do you expect we may see food shortages at some point in the future due to climate change causing reductions in food production?
That's a great question. And many of those studies I was referring to were motivated by trying to address that question. And basically they collected, in some cases, there were individual researchers, in some cases there were teams of researchers who were brought together in a workshop to try to address the question. But as I said, they actually said the answer to that question really depends on what we do in the next decade or two. If, for example, we reduce the consumption of meat, if we have an increase in people eating more vegetables rather than meat, if we can tailor genetically modified organisms to deal with environmental change, like making more drought tolerant. There's a new drought tolerant strain of wheat, which is being distributed throughout India right now to try to deal with drought. They actually are optimistic. Now, what I was worried about is that if you did a study and it said, no, we can't feed the 10 billion by 2050, that, and as you said, if we're at 7.8, then we're getting close to 10 billion, and 2050 seems we might get there before we get to 2050. That so much of it depends on the social change. That is much harder to predict. You can model climate change because it's mostly a chemical, biogeochemical process. But then, I think Jeff Sachs once said that the biggest thing that will affect the climate model is how much tax you place on gasoline, right? Or whether people will start using electric vehicles and electric buses. These are social, cultural changes, and that's much harder to put into. If you look at the climate models, a lot of times the great variability you see in that comes with the climate models, a lot of times come from the social factors, and it's true of agriculture as well. So what I was worried is that if I did a study and I said, you know what, we can't feed 10 billion by 2050, it might be rejected by the journal. Right? Maybe all the papers that have been accepted are the ones that had a positive message to deliver. That's not how it should work. I'm an editor for Science Advances. I handle about 1,000 manuscripts a year. I reject 500 of them. So I would hope that I would be, I would not use that kind of criteria. But yeah, it's many people have looked into this, and it'd be interesting for somebody who actually has familiarity with the census process, because I think that understanding more accurately what the population is going to be like is going to be very important into feeding into these models of whether we can feed people. But a lot of these models don't consider. Oh, I'll tell you that all of these models say that we must feed the 10 billion without expanding agriculture. So that's a condition of all of the models. They're not allowed to expand agricultural areas. They must use only the land we have now. So they achieve that in many cases by reducing waste, improving irrigation. There's a lot of leaky irrigation, and just improving a lot of efficiency. A lot of agriculture is very, very inefficient in the way it works. It's using old technology, old methods. So so they're optimistic that it can be done. I do feel that the demographic projections are pretty dodgy at times because it really depends on, if you increase education in the developing world, you will find that the birth rate will go down, right? These are things that are hard to figure into population models. And if you'll find that if you can improve the health of people, that again, the growth rate will change. If people will have children at a later age, because actually when you have your children affects the growth rate as well. Demography is really important, and census data is critical to that.
Wow, what a fascinating answer to that question. So, I mean, now there are more questions here. Let's see, how can we accelerate this? This goes back to the cultural dimension. How can we accelerate the cultural changes needed to adopt the economic incentives needed to ensure sustainable, resilient, and secure society?
Well, I think that it's sort of, as you said, cultural. I think that when students as they're learning, whether it's in K through 12 or high school or college, start to think about, the sort of if they learn economics or if they learn geography, if they learn about trade, that they start to consider natural capital as being something that is just as important as financial capital, as social capital, as human capital. Many of us we know the value of land. We know the value of patents on technology. We know the value of information. We will pay for an education, right? Because we know that the more knowledge and skills we have, the better our employment opportunities will be. But very often we don't know what natural capital means. And I think that it's starting to happen, but I think it needs to be accelerated. If you ask what needs to be accelerated, I think that people have to sort of, they have to become more comfortable with the idea that when we talk about services that we need, that ecosystem services, I don't like the word ecosystem services, maybe, and nature services, I think sometimes is misunderstood, right? It sounds, the word nature is a sort of a loaded word, but ecosystems, I think a lot of people don't quite understand what an ecosystem is, right? So it's a big word. So I wish we could come up, maybe you could come up with another word, but but ecosystem services or nature services are something that when I've given talks, public lectures, and I have said, imagine that you got a bill in the mail and you opened it and it was from the fungi. And the fungi formed a union and said, we're going to bill these suckers, right? Because we're working 24/7 to decompose all the waste that you people are producing, and you've never given us a vacation, you've never paid for our benefits. So here it is, and then I've actually used the economic models to say what that bill would be. And I think each person would have to pay per month several $1,000s to the fungi for the free services that are free right now. So thank goodness they're not unionizing and actually demanding pay. But people are smart. And the minute you translate it into something that they're familiar with, they grab it like that, right? And when I translate the idea of a service into a bill that you have to pay or into a tax that you have to pay, they understand right away what we're talking about. So that if the government said that you have to pay taxes for education, for military, for garbage, for security, for our politicians, you have to pay, your taxes pay for many, many things. And they said, and you have to pay for nature services, like setting aside 1/3 of the land. That's going to cost us something because we're not going to be able to build on it or grow food on it, right? We're going to have to pay to correct the carbon dioxide abundance that's in the atmosphere, that you're going to be taxed for that. And to say, that's okay, because you know what? Myself and my children and my children's children will benefit from this tax. And so I think that it can be done, but we need great communicators, great educators. We need people who can figure out how to quickly, you said accelerate, how to quickly get the message across. Because right now it's kind of a slow process, right? If we're waiting for a kid to go through 12 years before they go to college, and then 4 years in college, and then 5 years in graduate school, before they start talking to the policy and decision makers, that's a long time to wait, right? But if we could accelerate it by getting it into what politicians think about, decision makers think about, and especially what citizens think about, because they're the ones that vote, they're the ones that invest, they're the ones that tell their children what's right and what's wrong. It can happen fast, right? I'm not sure, much as I love universities, I'm not sure we're the fastest way to get things done.
Well, you're also, very extremely adept, obviously, at developing consortia. So,
Yes, that's good.
that's also a possibility. And I know that the EU is leagues ahead of the United States in terms of developing policy programs. So, maybe there are, since Columbia wants to be the global, take a global lead, perhaps there are, international consortia, which also could be developed, which might be interesting. But I'll get on to the next question, which is, Professor Naeem said that there are 5 major challenges we face now. What are the 5? He mentioned climate change, emerging diseases, mass extinction, and what are numbers 4 and 5?
Okay, so numbers 4 is invasive species. Okay, so invasive species are devastating landscapes. They're increasing the frequency of fires, and they're actually displacing native species. And so they're actually considered one of the big five. And the other one, this is a strange one, but it's actually nitrogen pollution. What I explain by that is that there are natural cycles of elements on Earth, and nitrogen is important to every living system. It's also one of the most short supplied elements in the world. Now, you might think that's strange because 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but we can't get that nitrogen. It's sort of sad because, you know, often when you're hungry or starving, it's because you need nitrogen and you're just starving or dying in a pool of nitrogen that you cannot get. Only the bacteria and the bacteria that live in the roots of legumes can actually fix nitrogen. But we found a way around that. You know, through the Haber-Bosch process, we make nitrogen fertilizers. We also actually produce a lot of nitrogenous gases through industry, especially through, you know, transportation and other sort of industrial processes. So we humans have doubled the natural nitrogen production of the world. I mean, we've basically taken the earth and we have doubled what the earth does on its own because it's been necessary to grow all the food. Now, we've not been very efficient at it. We waste a lot of fertilizer. We throw so much fertilizer out in the field, then it gets wet, and then it becomes these, you know, NOx gases that go up and warm the planet or run off into the water. So the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of that's created by fertilizer that's wasted as it goes down the Mississippi and creates pollution. So there have been a number of papers that actually some of them have suggested that nitrogen pollution is more of a problem than CO2. Carbon, so we've messed up the carbon cycle, but, you know, not nearly as much as we've messed up the nitrogen cycle. So that's number 5. Now, you know, it's actually international groups that get together in the United Nations and they say, what do you think? You know, they actually come, you know, they have these workshops that meet and they come up with these consensus of what are the 5 major problems. And those are the 5 major problems. So it's climate change, it's mass extinction, nitrogen pollution. Of course, climate change is basically CO2 pollution. An emerging disease, and I forgot if I said, you know, which one I said, but invasive species is one of them as well. Something some of us are quite familiar with, but we don't realize how massive it is in scale.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a real imbalance problem, you know, and that's also sort of an economics of ecology situation as well. It's like once you tinker with this one aspect of the, you know, the biosphere or an ecosystem, then suddenly other parts of it are compensating or, you know, overgrown or, you know, like things just, you know, become very imbalanced. And as you say, it's difficult to reverse that once, you know, that's already been started. But so another.
Well, I was gonna say, I don't know how many of you do gardening. We happen to have a house in the country, and I have to tell you, you know, I would say that probably half of our time gardening is fighting the invasive species. And then I do work at Black Rock Forest, and these invasive species are really devastating the forest, right? The understory is changing. We have bugs which are killing the trees and so forth, all of which come from, but it's exactly as you said. The movement of species from one habitat to another, even from one continent to another, has happened over tens of thousands of years. It actually is an important evolutionary process. What's happening now is humans have transported these things over the space of a few years or decades. We now have species from Asia, like the Asian carp, suddenly, you know, in the lakes in the United States. We have the lionfish, you know, another tropical exotic fish, now once in the aquarium trade as a pet, is now this devastating invasive species that's killing. Now that might have happened naturally over the space of thousands of years, but as you said, it's because we move around so much. We move these species with us. In many cases, it was by accident. Sometimes it was deliberate. So.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, and then there's no way to reverse that at all. I am an avid gardener, but I would say that my challenge is in you know, in England, and it's, as you say, drowning in the sea of you know, starving for nitrogen in the sea of nitrogen. I live in England, which is one of the, wettest places I can think of. And I am constantly faced with my plants being water deprived because of the climate change that's been happening over here. So now, instead of having regular rainfall, you have these sort of monsoon seasons. And then my plants just dehydrate, because if you only water the roots, then of course the roots rot and the foliage doesn't get green and doesn't grow. And it's just like that. And it's so delicate trying to maintain this balance, even in, the terrace garden that I try to maintain, in central London here. And you can see how climate change is actually even affecting like my tiny terrace garden in the back, and it's horrifying to imagine this on a mass scale. And some parts of the world are going to be even more deeply affected than North America. I mean, when you think about, the Middle East, for example, and Afghanistan, where, we've just pulled out, I mean, climate change is going to hit Afghanistan super hard, and they're not going to have any friends, and you pointed at the idea of international collaboration. And implementing these things, across borders and in alignment through these international treaties and agreements. And this has to happen. And it has to happen, with states that that don't play nicely with other states,
Yeah.
and how is that challenge going to be surmounted?
Well, all five of those, major global challenges, they are completely, disrespectful to geopolitical boundaries, right? Emerging diseases, nitrogen pollution, climate change, the fact that you divide sub-Saharan Africa into all these countries means nothing to these problems, right? And it takes international collaboration to tackle. We're living in a truly global world, and many of the problems are global. The five that I've listed are global problems. And, we can't say, well, we're going to saving 30% of the habitat in the United States doesn't help if Canada and Central America don't do it as well, right? Because those boundaries are just geopolitical, right? Well, except for the people who want to build an actual wall, but even so.
All right, I'm going to jump in here. So sorry. It looks like we are at time. But I wanted to thank both of you and just mention to all of our listeners that we did record, and we will send out the recording by tomorrow. And if you want to share any resources, professor slides or links or anything like that, we can include that in the email tomorrow as well.
All right.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the inspiring and insightful conversation, and also for telling us about all this fantastic and important research that you and your colleagues are doing at Columbia University, as well as these publications that are coming out for all of us to read and learn from.
And thank you for hosting a very complex topic. I imagine that it would have been hard to find someone else who could cross over all those different dimensions that we were talking about. And also for the organizers, I think we started getting together to think about this and plan it months ago. So thanks for finding, especially in the middle of a pandemic, thanks for finding the time to do this.
Absolutely. Likewise, thank you so much to Candice and to the Columbia University Club of Washington, D.C.
All right.